Well, good afternoon, everyone. I was commenting that I think it's the fabulous, cozy lighting, but everybody is whispering to themselves as though we are in a library. Everyone's like, hello, how are you? So I hope you feel the intimacy and the experience of being at the Ford School. I know we have many faculty, we have staff, and we have students in the room, but we also have some visitors. So welcome to the Ford School. I'm Celeste Watkins-Hayes, the Joan and Sanford Weill Dean here at the Ford School. So it's wonderful to welcome you here in person as well as those joining us online. Today we're here to celebrate our colleague and friend Sam Bagenstos as he delivers his inaugural lecture as the Arlene Susan Kohn Professor of Social Policy. Congratulations. So I will introduce Sam more fully in just a moment, but I want to first of all welcome members of Sam's family and many of his colleagues who are here with us this afternoon. And it's a true pleasure to recognize our special guests, good friends, and champions of the public good, Harold, Hal, and Carol Kohn, along with several members of the Kohn family. Welcome back to the Ford School. So I'd like to share a little bit about Hal and Carol and the Kohn Collaborative for Social Policy, a visionary initiative launched here at the Ford School in November of 2021. Since 2018, Hal and Carol Kohn and the Kohn Charitable Trust have committed more than $21 million to the Ford School to establish the collaborative, which catalyzes interdisciplinary research and policy impact to promote social equity and inclusion for all U.S. residents. The collaborative rests on three pillars: the Kohn professors, the Kohn scholars, and the Kohn policy impact. Its mission is to advance interdisciplinary research to promote a more inclusive and just society for all. At the core of the collaborative are 6 endowed professorships, an exceptional cohort of scholars who use academic inquiry to improve social policy and address tough challenges. The Arlene Susan Kohn Professor of Social Policy is one of these professorships, created to advance research and advocate for policy supporting the rights of people with disabilities in the U.S. It was named in honor of Hal's twin sister, Arlene, who lived with Down syndrome and passed away in 2016. With Hal and Carol's permission, I'd like to share a passage from what they wrote when they established the professorship. Arlene Susan and her twin brother, Harold Lewis, were born April 1st, 1945, to Carl and Martha Kohn in New York City. Arlene was born with Down syndrome. Arlene was not a silent person. She never hesitated to express her needs and wants clearly. She was kind and exhibited the importance of friendship. Arlene could remember names and incidents long forgotten by others and would always best her brother in their animal naming game. Her smile was magnificent, her love unconditional and boundless, her hugs penetrating and poignant, and her ability to barter harkened back to her father's skills. Arlene, by her very presence and actions, could powerfully redirect her family toward what was real and what was important. She contributed mightily to the lives of those around her in ways that could not have been imagined when Arlene was born. The Kohn Charitable Trust has established the Arlene Susan Kohn Professorship of Social Policy to honor her and to underscore the critical importance of advocacy and support for those with disabilities. In this way, we seek to add her voice to the national dialogue for those whose voices may be muted, but whose rights are essential to keeping the national fabric whole and vibrant. Sam is our newest Kohn professor, joining anti-poverty scholar Luke Schaefer, early childhood researcher Christina Weiland, and sociologist and demographer Pam Hurd, who will celebrate this spring. We're currently searching for experts in U.S. economic and environmental policy in the years to come to fill the remaining Kohn professorships. The Harold Kohn Professorship will focus on applied research and economic equity and inclusion, And the Lenore K. and Robert Damar Professorship will support research and policies advancing environmental sustainability. So continue to watch us work in this space as a school. It's an extraordinary group whose talents and commitment help make the Ford School the nation's top-ranked program in the United States for social policy. The Kohn Collaborative also makes it possible for us to offer 2 prestigious graduate fellowships, and we're delighted to welcome our current Kohn Scholars, second-year MPP student Paula Trujillo, and first-year MPP student Maricel Maribal. I believe that they are here, if they could just wave their hands. And they are going to help us lead the conversation after Sam's lecture. So the collaborative also supports, just so you know, seed grants, funds dissemination, networking, and advanced efforts through its Policy Impact Fund, including a major social policy impact prize for an individual or organization that advances domestic policy in the U.S. So all of this is possible thanks to the extraordinary generosity of Hal and Carol, whose cumulative support is the largest in Ford School history. Thank you. So now it is my pleasure to introduce Sam Bagenstos. Samuel R. Bagenstos has enjoyed a distinguished career in public service. Most recently, from June 2022 to December 2024, he served as general counsel to the Department of Health and Human Services, advancing and implementing critical policies from reproductive rights to the first ever Medicare drug price negotiation program, among many others. From January 2021 to June 2022, he served as general counsel to the Office of Management and Budget, where he contributed to President Biden's Day 1 executive orders, COVID response, and major labor, health, and environmental regulations. And he helped to craft and implement landmark legislation, including the American Rescue Plan, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and the Inflation Reduction Act. From 2009 to 2011, he served as Principal Deputy Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights at the Department of Justice, the second highest official in that division. He is actively involved in community and public affairs, both in Ann Arbor and statewide. He served as chair of the Michigan Employment Relations Commission, the state agency that enforces the rights of public employees to unionize and collectively bargain. In addition to his Ford School appointment, Sam is the Frank G. Millard Professor of Law at the University of Michigan Law School. Before coming to U of M, he was a professor of law and associate dean for research and faculty development at Washington University School of Law. Sam, I want to congratulate you. We want to congratulate you on this well-deserved recognition. Thank you so much. So after Sam's lecture, as we welcome him to the podium, we're going to have a microphone available in the room and for our online audience. So please submit questions using the links on our event page via YouTube, LinkedIn, and Facebook. And I also want to thank the Kohn Scholars for hosting the Q&A conversation. And tomorrow, by the way, we are going to be having a roundtable from 11:30 to 12:45 with our Kohn students and our Kohn professors. So lunch will be provided. We welcome you back. Hal and Carol, we thank you again. And Sam, we give you the podium.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This is really an incredible honor to have the opportunity to speak with you all, but to have the opportunity to hold the Arlene Susan Kohn Professorship of Social Policy. I will say it was a number of years ago when I was very happily on the faculty at the University of Michigan Law School, got a call from the previous dean of the Ford School saying, would you be interested in taking a piece of your appointment and bringing it to the Ford School, because we have these donors, Hal and Carol Kohn, who are extremely interested in supporting the work that you do in disability rights and disability policy, and we would love to see a piece of that at the Ford School. And I thought, well, this is really interesting. You know, there aren't a whole lot of donors out there in the world who want to support disability rights work, and had started to have these conversations, and was so happy to be able to get to know Hal and Carol, and to be able to get to see their vision for this Kohn collaborative, which is really starting to bear incredible fruit. So thank you very much to Hal and Carol for this work. Thank you to all of you for coming here. What I am going to do over the next half hour or so is take you on a bit of a journey that is going to start very positively. It's going to move in a very negative direction, and then I'm going to hopefully end with a little bit of hope, or at least determination. So I've entitled this lecture, very unprovocatively, Disability and the Return of Eugenics in the Poor Law. And where I will begin is with the very positive story, which is, for roughly half a century, United States law and policy focused on very positive aspects, moved unsteadily but very clearly in the direction of equality and integration and empowerment for individuals with disabilities, all sorts of disabilities, starting with a series of laws. The Rehabilitation Act, adopted in 1973, the first major disability rights legislation adopted in the United States. 2 years later, Congress passes a law, what was called then the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, now called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which guaranteed every individual with a disability who was a child under 22 with the right to a free and appropriate public education. At the time, 1 million children with disabilities were completely excluded from school in this country because they had disabilities. 5 million more children in this country were significantly excluded from school because of their disabilities. And with the stroke of a pen, this law, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, ended that and guaranteed every child with a disability the right to a free and appropriate public education. 2 years later, those of you who have seen the terrific movie Crip Camp know Joe Califano, the then Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, was pressured by disability rights activists to sign regulations implementing the Rehabilitation Act, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. Those regulations led to a remarkable change on campuses across the country. Every institution that received federal funding had to become physically accessible and accessible in all of its programs to individuals with a wide array of disabilities, a major step forward for people with disabilities. During the Reagan administration, 1988, Congress expanded the Fair Housing Act to cover disability for the first time, to prohibit discrimination on the basis of disability for the first time. A very significant step in ensuring that individuals with disabilities had the right to live integrated lives fully a part of the communities that they live in. 2 years later, President George H.W. Bush signs the Americans with Disabilities Act, says, let the shameful wall of exclusion finally come tumbling down, a law that is the first comprehensive anti-discrimination law protecting individuals with disabilities in employment, in everything that state and local governments do, including education, including transportation, including access to all public services, and in every retail good and service provider in the United States. This is a major change, making the United States the envy of the world in terms of its accessibility. And I teach graduate students from around the world, individuals with disabilities, who come to the United States and say, you complain about things here, you have no idea how much better things are in the United States for disabled individuals than they are elsewhere in the world, and it's because of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And when courts started to read the ADA very narrowly to make it hard for people to enforce their rights, Congress and President George W. Bush in 2008 adopted the ADA Amendments Act to overturn those judicial decisions and dramatically expand the scope of the ADA. And then 2 years later, President Obama signs his signature piece of legislation, the Affordable Care Act, which guarantees health insurance to people without being excluded for pre-existing conditions, which are often disabilities. Also includes, for the first time, an anti-discrimination provision, Section 1557, which protects individuals with disabilities against discrimination in all healthcare programs. Very significant. And in 2024, in the Biden administration, the Department of Justice, the Department of Health and Human Services, and other elements of the administration issued significant regulations to ensure that web and other services provided online are fully accessible to individuals with disabilities, that healthcare decisions are made without discriminating against individuals with disabilities. Something we saw was a major life and death problem during the COVID pandemic, and many other significant expansions of disability discrimination provisions. 50 years, a steady rise in protection for individuals with disabilities guarantees that individuals with disabilities can live full and equal lives as a full part of their communities. And there were important judicial decisions implementing these laws. And I'm just going to single out a few here, but there were many, many. For example, the Supreme Court in the Arline case in 1987 and in the Bragdon case in 1998 provided protections for people with AIDS and with asymptomatic HIV against discrimination founded in stereotypes, including people with AIDS and with asymptomatic HIV in the broader disability community. And when, in the run-up to the ADA, there was an effort to divide the disability community by excluding people with AIDS and HIV from the ADA, the disability community came together in the wake of the Arline decision and said, no, we are all going to work together to support rights for everyone with disabilities. And again, President George H.W. Bush signed that law. In 1999, the Supreme Court, in the Olmstead case, the Brown versus Board of Education for the disability rights movement said that individuals with disabilities have the right to be served by states in the most integrated setting appropriate to them as individuals, a decision that, as implemented by federal agencies and lower courts, led to dramatic expansion of services and supports for individuals with a variety of different disabilities in their own homes and communities. Very, very significant progress toward equality and integration for people with disabilities. And this was reinforced by changes outside of formal disability law and policy, but in broader social welfare law and policy that supported individuals with disabilities. So the Medicaid statute over the course of decades, starting in the 1980s, expanded and expanded and expanded the degree to which it supported people receiving services in their own homes and in their communities. Where it started off as effectively a nursing home law, it has become much more significantly a law providing long-term services and supports for individuals in their own homes and communities. We started to see, beginning in around 2000, the dramatic expansion of housing first approaches to homelessness. Of course, a very significant problem for individuals with psychiatric and other disabilities is homelessness. From punitive approaches that we had seen in the past, we saw a move to an approach that says we're going to give people housing first and then bring services to them. An approach that we have seen, the evidence shows, helps to address homelessness much better than more punitive approaches, and helps to ensure that people can recover and engage in the process of recovery from psychiatric disabilities, and helps to support people who have other kinds of disabilities. And we saw, again, the expansion of insurance, of health insurance, through the Affordable Care Act, but also through a series of other enactments leading up to the Affordable Care Act, which made it more possible for individuals with disabilities to go into the workforce and take jobs because they didn't have to worry about whether their health insurance needs would be covered. So for 50 years, we have a dramatic expansion of both rights and social policy that promote the equality, the integration, and the empowerment of individuals with disabilities. That expansion comes at the level of legislation, but also of executive branch implementation, also at the level of judicial interpretation, and it becomes a significant part of our society. That is now all under threat, okay? At this moment, we are seeing very significant threats to each of the pillars that have guaranteed individuals with disabilities equality, integration, empowerment. We see this in the courts. So the Supreme Court in the 2024 Grants Pass case endorsed very punitive approaches to homelessness, which have encouraged states to move away from the housing first approach and toward approaches of rounding people up, jailing people, and moving people out of the jurisdiction. In the AJT case just last term in the Supreme Court, the court made a decision that ultimately didn't matter very much, except that there was a concurring opinion by Justice Clarence Thomas, joined by Justice Brett Kavanaugh, who's often regarded as at the center of this court, who questioned whether disability discrimination laws should be interpreted to include a guarantee of reasonable accommodation, which has been the centerpiece of disability law since 1977, when those first Rehabilitation Act regulations were adopted. And in a lower court case decided by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, United States versus Mississippi, the court questioned the aspects of the Olmstead ruling that had led significantly to promotion of community-based services and supports for disabled individuals. So they rejected the idea that states could be liable for practices that put people at risk of unnecessary institutionalization. The court emphasized that the law should not place undue costs, whether fiscal costs or what the court called federalism costs, on states. And there is a great worry, in my view, and a great likelihood that the Supreme Court will agree with this and once again narrow the scope of disability discrimination law. But it's not just in the courts. There is also a significant threat from the executive branch. The executive branch is dramatically moving away from its prior commitment to integration and to such approaches as housing first. So, for example, on July 24th, 2025, just 2 days before the 25th anniversary of the signing of the Americans with Disabilities Act, President Trump issued this executive order, which you see at the far left of your screen, ending crime and disorder on America's streets. It's not really about crime. It is about disorder, and it's significantly about homelessness and disabled people. The executive order directs the Attorney General to seek, quote, the reversal of federal or state judicial precedents and the termination of consent decrees that impede the United States policy of encouraging civil commitment. So it adopts a policy of locking up people because they have disabilities. It directs the Attorney General to provide grants and other assistance to states that are trying to expand civil commitment and institutionalization. It requires the Department of Health and Human Services to provide grants to facilitate institutionalization. And it requires the Department of Housing and Urban Development to end the support that it had provided for housing first policies to the extent permitted by law. This executive order and the policies it reflects have encouraged localities and states to move toward much more punitive approaches. This is, if you read your New York Times just about a week ago, you saw this very long article about the homeless internment camp that is being created on the outskirts of Salt Lake City in the state of Utah, a city that had adopted a very progressive policy toward homelessness, toward providing services for homeless people, is now moving to locking up homeless people in a camp on the outskirts of the city as a significant result of these federal policies. But there are other federal policies as well. The executive branch has attacked accessibility as a significant part of its attack on so-called illegal DEI programs. So disabled people are very much in the crosshairs of that approach. And the Affordable Care Act, and this administration has also gutted the parts of the Department of Justice, the Department of Education, and the Department of Health and Human Services that enforce disability rights and that provide services for individuals with disabilities to ensure empowerment, integration, and employment. So very significant threat from the executive branch as well. And we are seeing very significant retrenchments at the legislative level and at the level of implementing legislation. So the Affordable Care Act's expansion of health insurance has already been significantly undone by the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which dramatically cut Medicaid and is very likely to almost entirely reverse, if not entirely reverse, the expansion of Medicaid that was created by the Affordable Care Act. The now quite significant likelihood that the Affordable Care Act subsidies created during the COVID pandemic will be rolled back, will, together with that rollback, effectively leave us with the same percentage of people covered by health insurance as existed before the Affordable Care Act was adopted. And that's compounded, the effects of these cuts are compounded by the massive impoundments of public health funds that we have seen and the devastating cuts to health programs that we have seen in the last year, all of which will lead to needless disease, disability, and death in the United States and around the world. So we have a very significant policy threat to the dramatic expansion and dramatic advancements that we made over 50 years. At the same time, we are seeing a libertarian eugenic ideology that's taken hold over health policy, one with the express goal of ending disability and the clear message that those who are disabled have their own and their families' choices to blame. And so on the slide, as I wrote it, but it somehow didn't come through here, in that white space there is a quote from RFK Jr. In my disability policy class earlier today, I provided a video clip. I was teaching about the Willowbrook case, a deinstitutionalization case, very, very famous from the 1970s. And there was a video clip of RFK Sr. walking out of the Willowbrook institution and calling it a snake pit and calling on the political system to provide reforms. And those reforms ultimately were part of the very significant progress we saw. We now have his son saying that individuals with autism are, quote, kids who will never pay taxes, kids who will never hold a job, will never play baseball, write poems, will never date, will never go to the toilet unassisted, right? So we have these very stigmatizing statements about disability coming from the highest levels. And this reflects a eugenic ideology, I would say, because the idea is that we should ideally eliminate disability by preventing it from happening in the first place or by hiding disabled people from view. For some of the policies we're seeing, the aesthetics seem particularly important to the policymakers who don't like to see homeless people in their field of view. That's a significant part of moving homeless people to the edges of cities. For others, it is much more about this idea that we need to eliminate disability. And we see this in RFK Jr.'s discussion of autism, but we see it everywhere in the discussion of disability policy in the current administration. And it's a view that has deeply uncomfortable resonances with eugenicism in the early 20th century in the United States and in Europe, as you can see. But I think there's something analytically and I have no idea what that slide was going to be. I think there is something analytically and conceptually interesting about the particular brand of eugenicism that we are seeing from the current president and the current Secretary of Health and Human Services and the folks who agree with them. A lot of times in the United States and world history, eugenicism presents itself as a communitarian ideology. It's about preserving the strength of the community and the nation. The focus on work and taxes in that quote from RFK that I just gave you seems to fit this well. And there are some aspects of the RFK Jr. Make America Healthy Again ideology that seem to focus on the way that corporate and social choices get people to be exposed to what he believes to be toxins that create disability. Now, he's often wrong about the particular toxins, but this aspect of his rhetoric is consistent with a sort of communitarian ideology, and it resonates with both work in public health that focuses on social determinants of health and social threats to public health, the way societal choices create illness. It resonates in a sort of ironic way with the way that many disability rights advocates have thought about disability as something that's created in significant part by the choices of society. But RFK Jr., like the administration he serves, clearly doesn't believe in the communitarian focus on social choices. You can tell by their gutting of the public health agencies that exist to challenge the societal choices that increase illness and to promote social choice that leads to health. You can also tell by his approach to disability, which is to undermine efforts to accommodate disability and turn hard toward prevention through an approach that emphasizes individual choice. And in particular, you can see the very strong libertarian aspect in RFK's persistent discussion of disability as something that's a result of bad individual choices. They might be choices to get vaccines. They might be choices to take Tylenol when you're pregnant. They might be choices to eat seed oils, whatever. And when RFK and the current president have resolved their Make America Healthy ideas, Make America Healthy Again ideas into policy, those policies have largely been deregulatory. They've focused on individual choice instead of mandates. That's largely true of vaccines. They've made it harder to access vaccines, but they have not actually banned vaccines. That's largely true as to food, loosening restrictions on the sale of certain kinds of foods, aiming to promote things like raw milk, but not restricting and regulating foods that are actually risky to us. That makes the current brand of eugenics that we are seeing a particularly toxic combination. It mobilizes the fear and stigma of disability. Like all eugenics, it's based on the idea of a natural hierarchy, and here disability is at the bottom. And disability has often, as Irving Goffman and others have shown, has often been key to constructing eugenic ideas. You know, there's this idea that scholars of disability talk about a lot, the so-called spread effect, or in the medical context, diagnostic overshadowing, the idea that often people focus on the disability as broadly disabling, as explanatory of all limitations that an individual has. But in addition to this general stigma, there's this idea of blame and fault, which is consistent with a poor law ideology. The idea that people are making choices that create disability in themselves. This resonates with the idea from the old poor laws that we shouldn't be too generous to poor people or people who claim to be sick or disabled for fear that they're faking it, or for fear that we're incentivizing people to opt into statuses that make them less productive. Now, this is something we have seen before in the rise of libertarianism, the rise of neoliberalism, and an alliance between neoliberals and social conservatives in endorsing these elements of the poor law tradition. And you see the results in such legislation as the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which relies on poor law ideas. The OBBBA, that is actually the acronym, it is actually called the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, says that food and medical assistance, SNAP, Medicaid, need to be strictly limited in time, and they need to be attached to significant limitations and regulations of personal behavior to require that recipients work when they can. Notably, the OBBBA extends these poor law ideas beyond cash assistance, where we've seen them since the 1996 welfare reform law, which was sort of a return to poor law ideas, but to health care. Right? Moving away from what had been the trajectory in American healthcare policy of moving towards the realization of a right to health care. Now we're seeing health care understood as an incentive to be dangled in front of people to encourage them to work and be productive in society, and to take away from them if they are not acting in a way that we deem to be sufficiently productive. Really strongly resonant with poor law ideals. As applied to disability, this new poor law inflected eugenicism means the state shouldn't work to assist people with disabilities, because doing so is just bailing out people who made bad choices. At the same time, it's undermining support for the collective public health measures on which we all rely to prevent sickness and suffering and to promote human flourishing in the first place. This ideology, of course, is consistent with broader policies that we've seen of gutting public health programs, both at home and internationally, and it will have the perverse effect of creating more illness and disability at the same time that we are taking away the services and supports that disabled people need. So this creates a political problem for advocates of disability rights and justice, and here's where I'm trying to make my more affirming turn. I can't quite say hopeful. I'm not a very hopeful person, but you know, I'm very much a sort of existentialist person. We fight because what else are we going to do but try to get to the right answer, to try to fight for the right result in the world. And we obviously, to the extent those of us who believe in disability rights, in equality, in empowerment, in integration, we need to fight in the immediate term against the retrenchment of these programs and supports that disabled people rely on, and in favor of empowerment and integration for disabled people, to fight against these new models, or these new old models of shunting disabled people away to the margins, often literally, as in Salt Lake City. But we also need to work much more broadly for a politics of solidarity and community. We need to work beyond the idea of independence and independent living that has so structured the disability rights movement for so long. So for a very long time, this notion of independence has been the resonant pole star idea for people with disabilities. We need to explain and fight for, both within and outside of the disability movement, the recognition that interdependence and not independence is the essential aspect of humanity, and a commitment to coming together as a society to do things together that we can't do individually. That is fundamentally what democracy is about, and it's also fundamentally what disability and disability policy should be about. And we need to fight as disability advocates, but also as advocates of a flourishing democracy, for a rebuilding of the public health state, to recognize that health is about collective choice, and to do what we can to share the effort to promote human flourishing for everyone. And that ultimately means we need to fight for interdependence, but also for justice, right? To move from this model of independence, which has been, again, so resonant for disabled people, to straightforwardly fighting for justice and arguing for justice for disabled people and what justice means. And what I like about this last slide, which is what I'll leave you with. So this is a slide from 1993. So it's 3 years after the adoption of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And in this slide are some very famous people in the disability rights world. So 3 people from the left in that photo, you can see, if you saw Crip Camp, you can see Judy Heumann. Judy was a friend of mine. Judy, when I ran for state Supreme Court in 2018 and lost by a ton of votes, I mean, oh my God. One of the first people to call me up was Judy Heumann, and she said, you know, I ran for city council in Berkeley, California, and I got clobbered. It's okay. You know, there are many things you can do. Judy Heumann, an absolutely wonderful person who fought for disability rights all her life. Justin Dart, the guy in the hat over on the far right, you know, proud Republican, you know, the person who convinced George H.W. Bush and Ronald Reagan to support disability rights. This is in 1993. And what are they doing? They're marching under the banner of justice, right? So the idea of disability justice has been a part of disability rights from the beginning, and it is a tradition that we need to return to. And that means less, certainly we need to play the inside game of continuing to fight to convince people that it's in their interest, regardless of their ideology, to support disability rights and disability integration. But it means much more straightforwardly making arguments that equality, integration, empowerment for people with disabilities are basic matters of justice. I am convinced that that is a fight that can be won and that will be won, but it is going to be a very, very long fight. And unfortunately, it's going to be a longer fight than we thought it would have been a few years back. So I want to say thank you for this. I am going to take some questions. The Kohn scholars will be kind of moderating the discussion. I did want to tell you before I left that tomorrow there will be a program. I don't know where the thing is. Tomorrow there will be a program on human thriving, the Kohn Collaborative Roundtable, in which the Kohn professors, Luke Schaefer, Pamela Hurd, Christina Weiland, and myself will discuss how human thriving can be infused into social policy, and I invite you to participate in that tomorrow, 11:30 to 12:50 in room 1230 of this building. Please be there. But now I am very happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Just to start off with the first question, also thank you so much for sharing. Really enjoyed hearing everything that you're working on. So my first question from the ones that were sent in is, what civil rights reforms do you believe are necessary to ensure the protection of disabled people when laws like the ADA and Civil Rights Act are obviously not doing enough at this point?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that's a great question. So we have a couple of problems with disability rights laws and civil rights laws. And one of the most significant problems is we have a judiciary that is very anti-civil rights, and so which has read civil rights laws very narrowly. One of the things that I describe having happened as part of this process of expansion of protections for individuals with disabilities between the adoption of the ADA in 1990 and the adoption of the ADA Amendments Act in 2008, what you had were a series of court decisions at all levels of the federal judiciary, dramatically narrowing the scope of the ADA, reducing it to well less than any of the supporters of the statute had thought. And that's why you get a conservative president, even like George W. Bush, a very conservative president, supporting legislation to expand the scope of the ADA in response to those judicial decisions. So one thing we need to do is write the laws in a way that clarifies just how broad they are. And so, we've seen some very significant areas where we need protection. So in the COVID pandemic, what we saw was disabled people were the most at risk for being harmed by policy and private choices in the COVID pandemic. Whether that was when you had a moment when there were too few ventilators to go around, many states and hospital systems had rules that explicitly put people with disabilities, with particular disabilities, to the back of the line for scarce ventilators, on the theory that what they wanted to do was maximize the quality of life of people they saved, and that people with disabilities would have a lower quality of life even if you saved their lives. So Alabama, for example, using archaic terminology, said if you had mental retardation, you would be at the back of the line for a ventilator. There were administrative complaints, there were lawsuits, there were other kinds of advocacy that forced a lot of that stuff to change. But what we learned is that there are a lot of explicit policies that still in the 2020s create life or death risks and discrimination for individuals with disabilities. We saw that the segregation of disabled individuals in nursing homes out of the way put them at a special risk for contracting and dying from COVID. And so what we need are laws that are very explicit to overcome a very anti-civil rights judiciary that will make clear that these life and death issues, in particular for individuals with disabilities, need to be addressed with a policy of non-discrimination, of accommodation, and of integration. I'd say the other thing that we really need, as the world has increasingly moved to providing goods, services, and programming online, we need a much, much more robust commitment, not just in the law, but in our society, to access to the web and to access to electronic materials for people with a whole array of disabilities.
Thank you so much. You also talk a lot about how the current administration has used eugenicists and poor law narratives. So my question is, how do we bring more of the important stories of the people that are being affected to the forefront?
Yeah, I think that is also a fundamental question these days. We are in this moment where people talk a lot about the attention economy. It's very hard to kind of fight through the ways in which social media technologies, media companies, other corporations kind of demand people's attention. And I think I'm the farthest thing from an expert in that, and I'm not sure I can answer that question except to say it is a fundamental problem. There used to be a way to make sure that people could see what was going on with disability. As I said today in my disability policy class, one of the things I did was show the class from the 1960s and 1970s some very well-known media depictions of the horrific treatment of individuals with disabilities. And because we had 3 broadcast networks and everybody watched the evening news, you knew you could get people's attention. Now it's just much harder to do that. And I think it's hard to mobilize people around any of these agendas without addressing that issue. And if I don't look at you, you should know it's because I can't see anything with the lights in my eyes. But I will hear you if you talk into the microphone.
Thank you. My name is Michelle Mead. I'm the director of the U of M Center for Disability Health and Wellness. I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about the challenges and possible pressures that occur at the intersection of disability and aging. As we know, disability rates increase greatly with age, and yet elder adults are less likely to identify as having a disability. Yet there are huge economic pressure and voting bloc in this country.
Yeah, I mean, so this has always been one of the issues. I mean, with disability policy and disability politics, a significant issue has been, well, what does disability even mean? Like, is there, what is the group of individuals with disabilities? Is it one group? Is it multiple groups? And, much of our policy in this country about aging is really, I would argue, disability policy. There is the idea that people should get to retire because they've worked long enough, but it's also true that people acquire disabilities as they age and they can't work, and we need to take care of folks who have put in a lifetime of work and can no longer work because of their disabilities. And healthcare issues attendant to age are often because of conditions that are disabilities and are often called disabilities. And yet people who are experiencing the disabilities that attend to age often don't see themselves as part of the disability community. And I think one of the kind of political aspects of creating and maintaining a disability rights movement in the United States has always been about expanding this idea of what is disability. And I think it is very important for disability rights advocates and advocates of the kind of disability policy that I've been talking about to be working with advocates for aging communities and to be working with individuals as they age to make people understand, no, what you need is not that different, actually, than what a younger person with the same condition needs. Like, these are really continuous. you do see aspects of this. I mean, so in the Obama administration, one of the very important institutional decisions they made within the Department of Health and Human Services was to take what had been the Administration on Aging and make it the Administration for Community Living, with the idea that all aging and disability services would be put together in the same sub-agency, because of a recognition that these are often very similar policy tools, but also because of a recognition that they wanted to create an understanding in the community. Organizations like AARP have been very significantly involved in disability advocacy. So in challenging unnecessary institutionalization of people, even younger people, in nursing homes, in challenging so-called wellness programs by employers that actually discriminate against workers with disabilities. So you see some places where that intersection has been kind of reinforced, but I think there's a lot of work to do.
Hi, I'm Love Lundy, a first-year MPP, and I was wondering if you can discuss how academic institutions can work with policy institutions to kind of solidify some of the things that we're seeing rolled back. You discussed in the 2024 things that happened that were positive for disability rights, that in healthcare interactions, you can no longer discriminate based on disability. It made me think about like type 2 diabetes and how care looks different for different people with type 2 diabetes based on their other demographics.
Yeah.
And so I guess I'm wondering, do we need to start going to the medical schools since we can't work in the courts anymore? Like, who do policy institutions work with now that we're trying to solidify this on the ground level and having to escape these other levers?
Well, I think it's always been super important to have research that shows how and whether, I don't take it as a given that any particular policy tool will work, but how the various policies that promote integration, that promote empowerment actually work successfully. And I think, looking at the intersection of different kinds of difference is incredibly important. There is this pressure now to no longer do that. And I think that's, one of the things we've learned is there is often bias that compounds. That's not the same, not the same bias when you have both disability and race, and different kinds of disability and race, or disability and sex and race, or, all of these things together. And I think that policy schools, medical schools, at the University of Michigan, we have all sorts of entities that actually do work that has done a great job in highlighting both the problems and the solutions in these areas, right? Showing that, for example, housing first interventions work both to address homelessness and to promote recovery. That's something that comes from academic work. And even as the federal government may be moving away from it, I think the academic work showing the utility of these approaches can be used as part of advocacy with localities and with states to, ensure that they continue to move in the right direction.
Thanks so much for your talk, Sam. So for over 2.5 years, you were general counsel at the Department of Health and Human Services. And one of the things that I wonder if you can reflect on as I listen to your talk is the really important role that disabilities rights activists have played in moving the policy needle, and the ways in which that conversation with the federal government became institutionalized in ways. I'm thinking about the President's Advisory Council on HIV/AIDS. I'm thinking about all of the different advisory groups and ways in which people with disabilities have created a kind of institutionalized mechanism to talk to whoever was in office at the time, and for years and years, in fact. So I wonder if you can reflect on that infrastructure and that policy communication conduit that basically got embedded within HHS, and how we think about going forward. And for those who are now on the outside and maybe not having the same level of access, how can they be influential and move the needle in the policy conversation now that those institutionalized conduits are being paused or dismantled?
Yeah, no, so I think many elements of the American disability rights movement have been very smart over many, many years in creating institutions to build and sustain political power, both access to government institutions, but also power within the community. And, so one of the things you've seen, so there are these advisory committees, which in some ways are, they're very useful as institutionalized ways to provide information to and pressure on the executive branch agencies, and often have been. And so, as you talked about with HIV and AIDS, I mean, that was the center. One way of telling the story about the Americans with Disabilities Act is actually a lot of the momentum for the Americans with Disabilities Act getting adopted in 1990 comes from Admiral Watkins and his advisory committee set up by President Reagan on HIV and AIDS, which, got a lot of input from the HIV community and the gay and lesbian community about what was going on with HIV and AIDS, and came up with a number of proposals, one of which was we need a comprehensive disability discrimination law, right? And so you see that conduit there, and that conduit continued through the years. And there are other advisory committees like that. As we're seeing right now, those advisory committees can be shut down very easily. But while they exist, they're a very good way of providing information and pressure. And often it's more information than pressure. It's, policymakers don't always understand what the effects of their policies are on communities they're not immediately thinking about. But the other thing that I think the disability community has been very smart about is through the years getting legislation that has shifted power and resources from the federal government and other government entities to the community members across the country. So independent living centers, so I have the Center for Independent Living in Berkeley, and yes, it's misspelled, I know, but the Center for Independent Living in Berkeley was the first of what became 400 federally funded centers in localities around the country. There's one in Ann Arbor that provide services for people with disabilities, services that are provided by and for disabled people, but also have been a hub of institutional organizing, of community organizing, of movement organizing. And although they're not explicitly political, they generate political activity. And there are a number of other policies like that that have created institutions around the country that actually put pressure on localities and states and private institutions within localities and states. And to me, that's as much the importance of the connection between the community and the federal government. So it's really a two-way kind of connection and extremely important. We have one more question, apparently.
As a lifelong educator, I'd like to know if you can speak to the status, to the issues of disability rights in education today, whatever you can highlight.
I would say a couple of things. So number one, I would have said a few years ago that disability issues in education were, an area where there's incredible struggle, but at a certain level, a broad political commitment across the political spectrum to ensuring that that kids with disabilities were appropriately served. So you saw that in the George W. Bush administration making disability a significant part of their No Child Left Behind law. A lot of people didn't like No Child Left Behind for a lot of reasons, but one of the significant aspects that people across the political spectrum liked was having high standards and expectations for individuals with disabilities and providing resources to match. We've seen that even in a very conservative, as I've said, kind of anti-civil rights judicial system and anti-civil rights Supreme Court, that even this Supreme Court has, by very broad votes, broadly interpreted the rights of kids with disabilities in schools. So, I would have said that's a comparative bright spot. Now, we know Congress in 1975 said the federal government would pay for 40% of the costs of serving disabled kids in school. They've never gotten above 17%, and now that number's around 11%. So we have significant funding issues. But what we're also seeing is, just a couple of weeks ago, all but, literally you can count on one hand the number of people, all but those people had been fired from the Department of Education's Office of Special Education Programs. So for the entire country, you had like this many people dealing with monitoring whether states and local jurisdictions around the country are complying with their obligations to provide free, appropriate public educations in the least restrictive environment to all kids with disabilities. So there's the retrenchment we're seeing right now is significantly focused on kids with disabilities. It's focused on education. There's a move away from the federal role in education, at least from the folks who are in charge of the executive branch right now. And it really targets disabled kids, unfortunately. And so that is a very scary moment.
Hi there. My name is Phoenix Velausen. I'm not a student here, but a visitor. I attended this because I was very interested in what you had to say specifically on this topic because without going into detail, it has been affecting my life significantly as a disabled person and many people that I know besides. One of the things that I've found over the course of the many scary headlines coming out of the federal government these days is things I feel that in lieu of the federal government having a lack of acknowledging our basic humanity, I would say that the local and the state and indeed academic institutions have more of a role to play in terms of how to affect things on, a basic level. I'm not going to go into a long diatribe about this, but basically, for the last 5 years, every single job I've had to leave because of discrimination from my employers. I'm currently at a job right now where I'm struggling with that on a sort of GM level where even after knowing these people for about a year and feeling very comfortable throughout the process in a very refreshing way, I'm starting to see a lot of things roll back in terms of accommodations for me. As my conditions have gotten significantly worse, I've also had to take more time away from work, and I have heard from other people who are friends of mine on management that I've been recently called lazy in a lot of meetings, that I have been called unreliable. And it definitely hurts, but it would be one thing if people held these opinions privately, and it's another thing to put them into the policy of how they run a business or how they run a government in bigger cases. So I would say my question within all of that is, on a local, state, business policy level, this may be very broad, but what are some things you think we could start to do on an institutional level to try and help people in our communities who are facing discrimination? I'm not the only one who's had this issue, but it's something where obviously it hits close to home, and I've had a lot of friends who face same challenges, like some people who can only work remotely now say that they've been turned away, at the door, or there's one company I know that keeps contacting me saying it's remote work only, but I have to fly out to Texas in order to have a meeting, and they won't accommodate anything otherwise, and obviously I'm not going to do that. But things like that, where it feels like a lot of things are put in place that don't need to be specifically to stop disabled people from being able to hold jobs that they otherwise could do. if it weren't for these very specific policies that seem to inadvertently or not target them. So I'm wondering, on any sort of policy-making level, what we could start to do in order to see less of that as the years go on.
Yeah, I mean, so that is, I think has always been a huge issue with disability. It's the refusal to see people who have a variety of different kinds of disabilities as being able to be, as being able to contribute productively, the often too much focus on someone has a disability and then attributing, negative qualities to that, and the failure to rethink the structures of our workplaces or workplace routines in ways that, end up excluding disabled people. And so that's been a huge issue forever with disability. And, I think it's gotten worse in recent years for a couple of reasons, right? So one is what I've described today. I mean, for many years, we had the federal government very loudly saying, hey, all these stereotypes about disability are wrong, and you have a legal obligation not to discriminate and to provide accommodations. But also, it's really good for you to have access to a workforce that you have not tapped yet, and this is a really good workforce. And what we're seeing is that bully pulpit, is no longer being used in that way. The threat of legal enforcement is no longer being used in that way. And so, yes, I think that means that states have to step up and start taking the place, local officials, people with platforms have to step up, but us in civil society. I think one of the lessons of the last 10 months is that civil society is incredibly important, and the institutions of civil society are incredibly important to sustaining not just a democratic culture, but a culture of equality that extends all the way to people's businesses and places of work and how they spend their time and their days. And we need to be very loudly talking about the benefits of having workforces that don't exclude individuals with disabilities, as well as talking about calling out discrimination for what it is. I think that's really important. And I think, unfortunately, and maybe this is the thing I'll end this answer with. Unfortunately, I think we saw with the COVID pandemic that a lot of the decisions that we make about how to structure jobs, about how to structure workplaces, are really contingent and unnecessary and exclude people unnecessarily. And when everybody had to work from home, many employers figured out a way to make that work. And it's only now, when people want to get past the pandemic, that they're starting to come down really hard on people who have disability-related reasons to work from home a lot of the time. And, I think that highlights some of the bias at issue here, whether it's, bias that is affirmative bias or bias that's unconscious in some way. And I think that's something we need to call out, and we need to kind of be bringing forth the models of the ways we did accommodate during the depths of the COVID pandemic and the way that worked, and fighting against this kind of retrenchment in that area.
Please join me in thanking Sam Bagginson.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam. The Arlene Susan Kohn Professor of Social Policy. Thank you so much. Please join us tomorrow. Sam, you had a fabulous slide for tomorrow's presentation. But tomorrow's roundtable, please join us tomorrow at 11:30 for the roundtable to keep this conversation going. Please join us outside right now for a reception. And please join me in thanking the Kohn family. Thank you so much. What an important event and a really important conversation. Thank you so much for all the work that you're doing. All right, everybody, please join us outside. And special thanks to our events team. Take care.